Welcome to Gone But Not Forgotten and welcome to the Chevrolet Tavera. This was the best-selling car from General Motors.
Sirish, wasn't Gone But Not Forgotten supposed to be about cars that we didn't want to forget?
Yeah, okay, I hear you. But fact is that on the comment stream of all the Gone But Not Forgotten videos on YouTube, the number of comments on Chevrolet is just ridiculous. Chevrolet this, Chevrolet that, the Spark, the X-Matizes, the SAIC cars, the Tavera. All of y'all want us to do videos on the Tavera, on General Motors vehicles, on Chevrolet, and that's what we have here. We are listening to you guys. The Tavera, okay, not the most iconic Chevrolet ever, but this was the best-selling Chevrolet in India, the best-selling vehicle that General Motors produced in India, and that's why this is here on this episode of Gone But Not Forgotten. I will drive it, we'll talk about our memories of the Tavera, how a Tavera feels like to drive today, and also we will have a timeline of General Motors' operations here in India. It started in 1994 when they entered into a joint venture with Hindustan Motors. In 1996, they started making the Astra, which was a very premium car back in the day. These are images of the Astra, and this very same car we will feature on Gone But Not Forgotten very soon. I have really fond memories of the Astra. As for the Tavera, well, not such fond memories, but let's get on with this episode. The Tavera wasn't the first Chevrolet in India. That honor, well, if you can call it an honor, went to the Subaru Forester, which for India was rebadged as the Chevrolet Forester. India was the only country where the Forester was called a Chevrolet, not a Subaru. That was in 2003. I was 3 years into my very first job working at Overdrive, and the Forester, that road test was assigned to me. In those days, doing a road test was a hugely prestigious and of course a very important ask. So I put my complete heart and soul into it. Those days, there were no websites where you could go and Google for information. So you had to really do proper library kind of research, did everything. Those days, as now, I was a huge rally fan, and Subaru, it was right up there in the WRC with Mitsubishi. Legends like Colin McRae, Ari Vatanen, Richard Burns. A year later, Carlos Sainz would also drive for Subaru. So Subaru, in my mind at least, and in the mind of enthusiasts, was right up there. And then taking out those Subaru badges and slapping on this Chevrolet bow tie, that did not sit well with me, and I said as much in my road test. Of course, the car was brilliant. There was everything to praise, nothing to criticize, except for the badge that you were looking at. You were not looking at a Subaru badge, you were looking at a bow tie. So I said as much, and the PR person at General Motors called Adil, my editor at Overdrive, and said, yeah, who's this bloody bacha who's doing this story? Well, turns out this bloody bacha is now doing an obituary for General Motors in India. And that just shows the arrogance that General Motors in India had, the sheer arrogance. Otherwise, why would you call a Subaru Forester a Chevrolet Forester in India, for instance? And those few and very few people bought the Forester. But all those people who bought the Forester all put Subaru badges on it. They had rally stickers on it because all of them were true blue enthusiasts. So anyway, a year later, 2004, came the second Chevrolet for India, which was the Chevrolet Tavera, which actually wasn't a Chevrolet. So Chevrolet was a brand that General Motors wanted to introduce in Asia as a kind of low-cost brand. Nothing to do with the American Chevrolet. The American Chevrolet were all those nice, big Yankee trucks. In Asia, Chevrolet was a low-cost brand. So India, we got Chevrolet because Opel by then was just about finished. General Motors did not really work on that brand, even though it had great cars, but the brand was finished. So Chevrolet for India. The Tavera was actually the Isuzu Panther. Those days, General Motors, they either owned or they had technical partnerships or they had JVs with almost half the major car brands in the world, including Fiat. They owned 20% of Fiat, and then 5 years later, they had to pay Fiat $2 billion to get out of their put option of buying the rest of Fiat. And then Fiat, they used those $2 billion to develop the 500, and that's the car that saved Fiat, thanks to General Motors money. So anyway, General Motors, they also had a long-standing technical partnership with Isuzu, which went back to the 70s, and that's how they got their hands on the Panther. The Panther, it was assembled in Halol, the plant which is now making all the MG cars. That was assembled from knockdown kits that they got from Indonesia. And of course, it had a diesel engine because those days diesels were very important. And General Motors, they really did not have any expertise in diesel engines, whereas the Japanese, they of course had expertise in diesels. So the Panther and of course the Tavera, it was in the similar mold to the Kijang, which was the Qualis, except the Tavera was half a size bigger than the Qualis. The Qualis inside was small. The Tavera was even a 10-seater. The one that we are driving right now is actually a 10-seater. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then in the jump seats at the back, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 people could fit in the Tavera. And honestly, okay, 10 people was a bit of a squeeze, but the space inside this cabin is massive. This was the big selling point of the Tavera. And of course, the second big selling point was the fact that Toyota, they put this segment on a platter and they gifted it to Chevrolet. When the Tavera was launched in India, that coincided with the Qualis being withdrawn from India. So the second generation Qualis, which was actually not even an MUV, it went up to an MPV. So there was no direct rival to the Tavera. There was the Sumo, there was the Bolero, you could say the Scorpio also, but the Scorpio really wasn't in this class. So basically, everybody who wanted a Qualis, they could not buy a Qualis because Toyota had withdrawn that. So they had to buy the Tavera, whether they liked it or not. And that was General Motors' solid stroke of luck. I think that was the only time they really timed things well and they introduced the Tavera at the proper opportune moment. The diesel engine, 2.5 liters, turbocharged. It made 73 bhp and 171 Newton meters of torque. 0 to 100, it took around 23-24 seconds. So it took its own sweet time to get up to any speed. But then compared to the standards of that era, this was actually a second or maybe even 2 seconds faster than the Qualis. So even though this was slow, properly slow, it was faster than the Qualis. But the Qualis, the Toyota engine, was smooth. It was so refined. It really opened our eyes to what a diesel engine could do in terms of NVH. Whereas this is a properly loud, gruff, noisy engine. Now turbocharged, but it had what was called a soft turbo. So you could barely feel the turbo kicking in, which was good because it was very smooth, also pretty efficient for its time, but not the most refined, not very fast. 5-speed manual gearbox. Now this engine was actually made by Hindustan Motors. They had another company in Pithampur that made powertrains, and that's the unit that made these engines. In fact, the Tavera, it had 85% localization, which was the highest localization content of any General Motors car in India till date. The Optra, I think it was some 30-40%, whereas Tavera 85%, and that's how they managed to get the pricing also spot on. Now the Tavera was launched in 2004, and in 2006 came the Neo. And in those days, if you put a sticker on the side of a car, that qualified as a facelift. If you put 2 stickers, that qualified as an all-new car. So facelift, I don't know what really was facelifted. You had a Neo badge, which is still there on the boot of this Tavera. I think this brownish interior came with the Neo, but apart from that, everything remained the same. So the dash, now the standards of the time weren't like terrific. The Qualis, if you look on the inside, there's nothing really to write home about. But even by that Qualis standards, this is okay, just about adequate. This Pioneer CD player, obviously it is an aftermarket system. The cover on the steering wheel, that is also aftermarket. These stocks were from the Maruti 800. AC vents, you can't switch it off, and very flimsy AC vents. You have a slot out here to throw knickknacks. You have an ashtray. You have another slot out there to maybe put your mobile phone. Small glove box, small door pocket. This example has got these power windows, but I think these are aftermarket power windows and they don't work. In fact, this door also doesn't open. Guys from the outside have to open the door so you can get out. So the quality wasn't really all that great. If you drive a Qualis today, even though it's older than the Tavera, everything feels so much better put together. Whereas this, everything is rattling and the vibrations are something else. And that brings me to the quality of the driving experience, which was all over the place. Of course, this has become worse over time. And these things were really abused. And just look at the steering. I'm going in a straight line, and this is the play that you get. Ridiculous. Incredible how things were built in those days. You obviously will have noticed that the rear is jacked up. That was not stock. General Motors never made the Tavera with the rear sticking out that much. But what a lot of people did afterwards when the suspension blew or when they went for refurbishment was fit slightly taller leaf springs. So when you actually put 10 people in it or you loaded it till the roof, then it sat straight. Otherwise, in the stock configuration, if you really loaded it, the headlamps would be lighting up the moon. So that's why all the unladen Taveras that you see all have this massive rear hide head, all are pointing down. And even when you're driving it, you're sort of looking down, you're feeling like you're pointing downwards. And of course, that kills whatever little dynamics that the Tavera had. And even small bumps, because of that jacked up leaf spring ride height, is also a bit cumbersome. Okay, it has got power steering, which is saving grace, but it's bouncy, it's... but it has space. It has a lot of space. 10 people, 10-seater. Are 10-seaters even legal these days to register on white plates? God knows. The gearbox actually is surprisingly good, precise. Look, there's no play in this. It actually works pretty well, I must say. The handbrake, that's this pull type handbrake, which you also got in the Qualis. The Tavera, it had disc brakes up front, drum brakes at the rear. It was a ladder frame, and if you stepped on it hard, I'm not going to do that because I don't trust this really, but if you stepped on it hard, it would move all over the place. And as you can surmise, I'm not really a fan of the Tavera. I was never a fan of the Tavera. Of course, fanboys will object to my saying that, but I never really liked the Tavera. So that was in 2006, and then because the Tavera had no real competition, General Motors, they sat back, smoked their cigars on their leatherback chairs and were very pleased with themselves, and they kept flogging the Tavera, kept flogging it until the shit hit the proverbial ceiling. In 2013 came the huge scandal where General Motors, they had to recall 1,14,000 Taveras. So thanks to a whistleblower, it came to light that General Motors officials, they were misleading the Indian authorities about the emissions and fuel consumption data of their engines. So for testing, they were supplying specially built engines that would actually give out those emission and fuel consumption readings. But the actual Taveras on the road were not delivering that data. So thanks to the whistleblower, that came to light. General Motors had to issue the recall. They got slapped with a huge fine. General Motors, their cheating scandals actually predated Volkswagen. It predated Dieselgate. So obviously they had to stop making the Tavera. And then they launched the Tavera Neo 3. Now that version, it threw out this 2.5 liter diesel engine because they couldn't get it to comply with the BS3 emission norms. and they used the 2-liter diesel engine that was being made by Sonalika, and that had a rover designed engine which Sonalika was making in India. So General Motors, they bought that engine. Power obviously went down. In fact, power was less even compared to this 2.5-liter diesel engine, and that was the Neo 3. That Neo 3 had a slight facelift, so the headlamps had slight tweaks in it, and they flogged that for I think 2 years until they could finally bring this 2.5-liter diesel engine up to the BS3 emission standards. And General Motors, they weren't immune to messes. So before this emission scandal came about, in 2008, there was that financial crisis. General Motors worldwide, they went bankrupt. So to bail their India operations out, their joint venture partner in China, SAIC, they bought over the General Motors stake. So then it became a 50-50 joint venture between General Motors and SAIC in India. And that's when the first wave of the Chinese cars started coming in. So that's when the investment went into General Motors' second plant in Talegaon. In fact, the plan was to shut halal altogether and move everything to Talegaon, but that plan got a little bit delayed. But the plan was to make light trucks from SAIC and of course the other SAIC cars badged in India as Chevrolet. So you had the Enjoy MPV, which we will do a Gone But Not Forgotten on it, and it is the most ironically named vehicle because I did not enjoy driving the Enjoy one bit. Then you had the Sail, you had the hatchback version of it which was called the Yuva. So a whole bunch of Chinese cars, none of them really worked in India. You had the Trailblazer, but that was another Isuzu and that was slightly better than everything else. But it has to be said that together, General Motors and SAIC, they invested 1 billion in India, mainly into the Talegaon plant, which was outside Pune, that was going to make a whole range of Chevrolet cars and light trucks, SAIC light trucks. And then in 2012, General Motors, they bought back SAIC's stake in the Indian operation. So General Motors stake went up to 93%, 7% was retained by SAIC. That's when they started to introduce all those Chevrolet vehicles. In fact, in 2015, Mary Barra, the then head of General Motors, she came to India and promised a further 1 billion investment in India. Now, that was going to go into a whole range of new vehicles. Something called the Spin was going to come, which was going to rival the Ertiga. A new generation platform was going to be made. An SUV to rival the Creta was going to be made. India was going to be the hub for small diesel engines. I think some 10 or 20 models were planned for India. That was in 2015. 1 billion investment. And then 2 years later, General Motors packed up and went home.
General Motors will be ceasing sales in India and sell its South African plant as well as the joint venture holding and parts and distribution center to Isuzu Motors.
Further retrenchment by General Motors. The carmaker says it will stop selling vehicles in India by the end of this year and cancel most of a planned $1 billion investment to build a new line of low-cost cars there.
After 21 years in India, at the end of 2017, General Motors pulled their plug on the Indian operations. The Tavera, it wasn't the last vehicle to be made in India because the Talegaon plant, it continued to operate, continued to make cars for exports. But the Tavera is the lasting legacy of the world's largest car manufacturer's Indian innings. This was their best-selling vehicle. This was probably the vehicle that was most suited to the segment that it was in, the most Indianized, so to speak. But can you imagine, the world's largest car manufacturer, they just could not make a meal of the Indian market. This is all they have to show for it. And the losses, just take a wild guess. Figures that are quoted, $1.1 billion. That's how much the General lost right here in India. Do you have any memories of General Motors cars? Do you have any memories of the Tavera? Let us know in the comments below. And of course, tell us what we should be featuring next on Gone But Not Forgotten.